Battle of Stalingrad, the 17th of July 1942 to the 2nd of February 1943, was a major battle on the Eastern Front of World War II. Beginning when Nazi Germany and its Axis allies attacked and became locked in a protracted struggle with the Soviet Union for control over the Soviet city of Stalingrad, now known as Volgograd, in southern Russia. The battle was characterized by fierce close-quarters combat and direct assaults on civilians in aerial raids. The battle epitomized urban warfare, being the single largest and costliest urban battle in military history. It was the bloodiest and fiercest battle of the entirety of World War II, and arguably in all of human history, as both sides suffered tremendous casualties amidst ferocious fighting in and around the city. The battle is commonly regarded as the turning point in the European theater of World War II, as Germany's Oberkommando der Wehrmacht was forced to withdraw a considerable amount of military forces from other regions to replace losses on the Eastern Front. By the time the hostilities ended, the German 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army had been destroyed and Army Group B was routed. The Soviets' victory at Stalingrad shifted the Eastern Front's balance of power in their favor, while also boosting the morale of the Red Army. Both sides placed great strategic importance on Stalingrad, for it was the largest industrial center of the Soviet Union and an important transport hub on the Volga River. Controlling Stalingrad meant gaining access to the oil fields of the Caucasus and having supreme authority over the Volga River. The city also held significant symbolic importance because it bore the name of Joseph Stalin, the incumbent leader of the Soviet Union. As the conflict progressed, Germany's fuel supplies dwindled, and thus drove it to focus on moving deeper into Soviet territory and taking the country's oil fields at any cost. The German military first clashed with the Red Army's Stalingrad front on the distant approaches to Stalingrad on the 17th of July. On the 23rd of August, the 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army launched their offensive with support from intensive bombing raids by the Luftwaffe, which reduced much of the city to rubble. The battle soon degenerated into house-to-house fighting, which escalated drastically as both sides continued pouring reinforcements into the city. By mid-November, the Germans, at great cost, had pushed the Soviet defenders back into narrow zones along the Volga's west bank. However, winter set in within a few months, and conditions became particularly brutal, with temperatures often dropping tens of degrees below freezing. In addition to fierce urban combat, brutal trench warfare was prevalent at Stalingrad as well. By the spring of 1942, despite the failure of Operation Barbarossa to defeat the Soviet Union in a single campaign, the Wehrmacht had captured vast territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic republics. On the Western Front, Germany held most of Europe. The U-boat offensive was curbing American support. And in North Africa, Erwin Rommel had just captured Tobruk. In the east, the Germans had stabilized a front running from Leningrad to Rostov, with several minor salients. Hitler remained confident of breaking the Red Army, despite heavy losses west of Moscow in the winter of 1941-42, because large parts of Army Group Center had been wrested and re-equipped. Hitler decided that the 1942 summer campaign would target the southern Soviet Union. The initial objectives around Stalingrad were to destroy the city's industrial capacity and block the Volga River traffic, crucial for connecting the Caucasus and Caspian Sea to central Russia. The capture of Stalingrad would also disrupt Lend-Lease supplies via the Persian corridor. On the 23rd of July 1942, Hitler expanded the campaign's objectives to include occupying Stalingrad, a city with immense propaganda value due to its name, which bore that of the Soviet leader. Hitler ordered the annihilation of Stalingrad's population, declaring that after its capture, all male citizens would be killed and women and children deported due to their thoroughly communistic nature. The city's fall was intended to secure the northern and western flanks of the German advance on Baku to capture its petroleum resources. This expansion of objectives stemmed from German overconfidence and an underestimation of Soviet reserves. Meanwhile, Stalin, convinced that the main German attack would target Moscow, prioritized defending the Soviet capital. As the Soviet winter counteroffensive of 1941-1942 culminated in March, the Soviet High Command began planning for the summer campaign. Although Stalin desired a general offensive, he was dissuaded by Chief of the General Staff Boris Shaposhnikov, Deputy Chief of the General Staff Alexander Vasilevsky, and Western Main Direction Commander Georgy Zhukov. Ultimately, Stalin instructed that the summer campaign be based on active strategic defense, while also ordering local offensives across the Eastern Front. Southwestern Main Direction Commander Semyon Timoshenko proposed an attack from the Izium salient south of Kharkiv to encircle and destroy the German 6th Army. Despite opposition from Shaposhnikov and Vasilevsky, Stalin approved the plan. After delays in troop movements and logistical challenges, the Kharkiv operation began on the 12th of May. The Soviets achieved initial success, prompting 6th Army Commander Friedrich Paulus to request reinforcements. However, the German counterattack on the 13th of May halted the Soviet advance. On the 17th of May, Ewald von Kleist's forces launched Operation Friedrichs I, encircling and destroying much of the Soviet forces in the ensuing Second Battle of Kharkiv. The defeat at Kharkiv left the Soviets vulnerable to the German summer offensive. Despite the setback, Stalin continued to prioritize defending Moscow, allocating only limited reinforcements to the southwestern front.
If I do not get the oil of my cup in Grozny, then I must finish this war,"
Adolf Hitler said. Army Group South was selected for a sprint forward through the southern Russian steppes into the Caucasus to capture the vital Soviet oil fields there. The planned summer offensive, codenamed Fall Blau, Case Blue, was to include the German 6th, 17th, 4th Panzer and 1st Panzer armies. Hitler intervened, however, ordering the Army Group to split in two. Army Group South, under the command of Wilhelm List, was to continue advancing south towards the Caucasus as planned with the 17th Army and 1st Panzer Army. Army Group South B, including Paulus's 6th Army and Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, was to move east towards the Volga and Stalingrad. Army Group B was commanded by General Maximilian von Weichs. The start of Case Blue had been planned for late May 1942. However, a number of German and Romanian units that were to take part in Blau were besieging Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. Delays in ending the siege pushed back the start date for Blau several times, and the city did not fall until early July. Operation Friedrichs, won by the Germans against the Izium Bulge, pinched off the Soviet salient in the Second Battle of Kharkiv and resulted in the envelopment of a large Soviet force between the 17th of May and the 29th of May. Similarly, Operation Wilhelm attacked Volchansk on the 13th of June, and Operation Friedrichs attacked Kupiansk on the 22nd of June. Blau finally opened as Army Group South began its attack into southern Russia on the 28th of June 1942. The German offensive achieved rapid success, as Soviet forces offered little resistance in the vast empty steppes and started streaming eastward. Several attempts to re-establish a defensive line failed when German units outflanked them. Two major pockets were formed and destroyed. The first, northeast of Kharkiv on the 2nd of July, and a second around Milerovo, Rostov Oblast, a week later. Meanwhile, the Hungarian 2nd Army and the German 4th Panzer Army had launched an assault on Voronezh, capturing the city on the 5th of July. The initial advance of the 6th Army was so successful that Hitler intervened and ordered the 4th Panzer Army to join Army Group South A to the south. A massive roadblock resulted when the 4th Panzer and the 1st Panzer choked the roads, stopping both in their tracks while they cleared the mess of thousands of vehicles. The traffic jam is thought to have delayed the advance by at least 1 week. With the advance now slowed, Hitler changed his mind and reassigned the 4th Panzer Army back to the attack on Stalingrad. By the end of July, Soviet forces were pushed back across the Don River. At this point, the Don and Volga rivers are only 65 kilometers, 40 miles apart, and the Germans left their main supply depots west of the Don. The Germans began using the armies of their Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian allies to guard their left northern flank. Italian actions were also mentioned in official German communiques. Italian forces were generally held in little regard by the Germans and were accused of low morale. In reality, the Italian divisions fought comparatively well, with the 3rd Infantry Division, Ravenna, and 5th Infantry Division, Kasyria, showing spirit, according to a German liaison officer. Italian forces were forced to retreat only after a massive armored attack in which German reinforcements failed to arrive in time. To the south, Army Group A was pushing far into the Caucasus, but the advance slowed as supply lines grew overextended. The two German army groups were too far apart to support one another. After German intentions became clear in July, Stalin appointed General Andrei Yeryomenko commander of the Southeastern Front on the 1st of August 1942. Yeryomenko and Commissar Nikita Khrushchev were tasked with planning the defense of Stalingrad. Beyond the Volga River on the eastern boundary of Stalingrad, additional Soviet units were formed into the 62nd Army under Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov on the 11th of September 1942. Tasked with holding the city at all costs, Chuikov proclaimed, "We will defend the city or die in the attempt." The battle earned him one of his two Hero of the Soviet Union awards. German forces first clashed with the Stalingrad front on the 17th of July on the distant approaches to Stalingrad in the bend of the Don. A significant clash in the early stages of the battle was fought at Kalach, in which we had to pay a high cost in men and material. Left on the Kalach battlefield were numerous burnt-out or shot-up German tanks. Military historian David Glantz indicated that 4 hard-fought battles, collectively known as the Kotlüben operations, north of Stalingrad, where the Soviets made their greatest stand, decided Germany's fate before the Nazis ever set foot in the city itself, and were a turning point in the war. Beginning in late August and lasting into October, the Soviets committed between 2 and 4 armies in hastily coordinated and poorly controlled attacks against the Germans' northern flank. The actions resulted in over 200,000 Soviet army casualties, but did slow the German assault. The Germans formed bridgeheads across the Don on the 20th of August, with the 295th and 76th Infantry Divisions, enabling the 14th Panzer Corps to thrust to the Volga north of Stalingrad. The German 6th Army was only a few dozen kilometers from Stalingrad. The 4th Panzer Army, ordered south on the 13th of July to block the Soviet retreat, weakened by the 17th Army and the 1st Panzer Army, had turned northwards to help take the city from the south. On the 19th of August, German forces were in position to launch an attack on the city. On the 23rd of August, the 6th Army reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in pursuit of the 62nd and 64th Armies, which had fallen back into the city, Kleist said after the war.
The capture of Stalingrad was subsidiary to the main aim. It was only of importance as a convenient place, in the bottleneck between Don and the Volga, where we could block an attack on our flank by Russian forces coming from the east. At the start, Stalingrad was no more than a name on the map to us.
The Soviets had enough warning of the German advance to ship grain, cattle, and railway cars across the Volga out of harm's way. This harvest victory left the city short of food even before the German attack began. Before the Heer reached the city itself, the Luftwaffe had cut off shipping on the Volga. In the days between 25 and the 31st of July, 32 Soviet ships were sunk, with another 9 crippled. General Oberst Wolfram von Richthofen's Luftflotte 4 dropped some 1,000 tons of bombs on the 23rd of August, with the aerial attack on Stalingrad being the most single intense aerial bombardment at that point on the Eastern Front, and the heaviest bombing raid that had ever taken place on the Eastern Front. At least 90% of the city's housing stock was obliterated as a result. The Stalingrad tractor factory continued to turn out T-34 tanks up until German troops burst into the plant. The 369th Croatian Reinforced Infantry Regiment was the only non-German unit selected by the Wehrmacht to enter Stalingrad city during assault operations, with it fighting as part of the 100th Jaeger Division. Georgy Zhukov, who was Deputy Commander-in-Chief and commander of Stalingrad's defense during the battle, noted the importance of the battle, stating that,
"It was clear to me that the battle for Stalingrad was of the greatest military and political significance. If Stalingrad fell, the enemy command would be able to cut off the south of the country from the center. We could lose the Volga, the important water artery, along which a large amount of goods flowed from the Caucasus."
Stalin rushed all available troops to the east bank of the Volga, some from as far away as Siberia. Regular river ferries were quickly destroyed by the Luftwaffe, which then targeted troop barges being towed slowly across by tugs. It has been said that Stalin prevented civilians from leaving the city in the belief that their presence would encourage greater resistance from the city's defenders. Civilians, including women and children, were put to work building trench works and protective fortifications. Casualties due to the air raid on the 23rd of August and beyond are debated, as between 23 and the 26th of August, Soviet reports indicate 955 people were killed and another 1,181 wounded as a result of the bombing. However, death toll of civilians due to the bombing has been estimated to have been 40,000 or as many as 70,000, though these estimates may be exaggerated. Also estimated are 150,000 wounded. The Soviet Air Force, the Vojenno-Vzdušные Sily, VVS, was swept aside by the Luftwaffe. The VVS bases in the immediate area lost 201 aircraft between 23 and the 31st of August, and despite meager reinforcements of some 100 aircraft in August, it was left with just 192 serviceable aircraft, 57 of which were fighters. Early on the 23rd of August, the German 16th Panzer and 3rd Motorized Divisions attacked out of the Vertieki bridgehead with a force 120 tanks and over 200 armored personnel carriers strong. The German attack broke through the 1,382nd Rifle Regiment of the 87th Rifle Division and the 137th Tank Brigade, which were forced to retreat towards Dmitrievka. The 16th Panzer Division drove east towards the Volga, supported by the strikes of Henschel H's 129 ground attack aircraft, crossing the railway line to Stalingrad, 564-kilometer station around midday. Both divisions continued their rush towards the river. Around 1500, Hyacinth Graf Strakowitz's Panzer Detachment and the Kampfgruppe of the 2nd Battalion, 64th Panzer Grenadier Regiment from the 16th Panzer reached the area of Latoshanka, Rynok and Spartanovka, northern suburbs of Stalingrad, and the Stalingrad tractor factory. A Soviet female soldier stated about the battle that,
"I had been imagining what war was like. Everything on fire, children crying, cats running about, and when we got to Stalingrad it turned out to be really like that, only more terrible."
One of the first units to offer resistance in this area was the 1077th Anti-Aircraft Regiment, covering the Stalingrad tractor factory and the Volga ferry near Latoshanka. The majority of the regiment was composed of men, but its directing and range-finding crews and unit headquarters were made up of women. Several women also crewed anti-aircraft guns. The 1077th was notified of the German tanks' approach at 1430, and its 6th Battery, dominating the Sukhaya Mekhika ravine, claimed the destruction of 28 German tanks. Later that day, its 3rd Battery on the road between Yerzovka and Stalingrad saw particularly intense fighting against the 16th Panzer, reportedly fighting shot for shot. 2 women were decorated for their actions that day, and the regiment's report praised the exceptional steadfastness and heroism of the women soldiers. The regiment lost 35 guns, 18 killed, 46 wounded, and 74 missing on 23 and the 24th of August. The 16th Panzer Division's history mentioned its encounter with the regiment, claiming the destruction of 37 guns, and the unit's surprise that its opponents had in part included women. In the early stages of the battle, the NKVD organized poorly armed workers' militias, similar to those that had defended the city 24 years earlier, composed of civilians not directly involved in war production for immediate use in the battle. The civilians were often sent into battle without rifles. Staff and students from the local technical university formed a tank destroyer unit. They assembled tanks from leftover parts at the tractor factory. These tanks, unpainted and lacking gun sights, were driven directly from the factory floor to the front line. They could only be aimed at point-blank range through the bore of their gun barrels. Chuikov later remarked that soldiers approaching the battle would say, "We are entering hell." But after 1 or 2 days they said, "No, this isn't hell. This is 10 times worse than hell." By the end of August, Army Group South B had finally reached the Volga, north of Stalingrad. Another advance to the river south of the city followed, while the Soviets abandoned their Rososhka position for the inner defensive ring west of Stalingrad. The wings of the 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army met near Yevlachny along the Zaritsa on the 2nd of September. A letter found on the body of a German officer described the insanity of the battle and brutal nature of the urban combat.
We must reach the Volga. We can see it, less than a kilometer away. We have the constant support of our aircraft and artillery. We are fighting like madmen, but cannot reach the river. The whole war for France was shorter than the fight for one Volga factory. We must be up against suicide squads, Iskis. They have simply decided to fight to the last soldier. And how many soldiers are left over there? When will this hell come to an end?
On the 5th of September, the Soviet 24th and 66th Armies organized a massive attack against 14th Panzer Corps. The Luftwaffe helped repel the offensive by heavily attacking Soviet artillery positions and defensive lines. The Soviets were forced to withdraw at midday after only a few hours. Of the 120 tanks the Soviets had committed, 30 were lost to air attack. On the 13th of September, the battle for the city itself began, with German forces launching an attack which overran the small hill where the 62nd Soviet Army headquarters was established. In addition, the railway station was captured, and German forces advanced far enough to threaten the Volga landing stage. Soviet operations were constantly hampered by the Luftwaffe. On the 18th of September, the Soviet 1st Guards and 24th Army launched an offensive against 8th Army Corps at Kotlubin. 8th Flieger Corps dispatched multiple waves of Stuka dive bombers to prevent a breakthrough. The offensive was repelled. The Stukas claimed 41 of the 106 Soviet tanks knocked out that morning, while escorting Bf-109s destroyed 77 Soviet aircraft. Lieutenant General Alexander Rodimtsev was in charge of the 13th Guards Rifle Division and received one of 2 Hero of the Soviet Union awards issued during the battle for his actions. Stalin's order number 227 of the 27th of July, 1942 decreed that all commanders who ordered unauthorized retreats would be subject to a military tribunal. Blocking detachments composed of NKVD or regular troops were positioned behind Red Army units to prevent desertion and straggling, sometimes executing deserters and perceived malingerers. During the battle, the 62nd Army had the most arrests and executions, 203 in all, of which 49 were executed, while 139 were sent to penal companies and battalions. Blocking detachments of the Stalingrad and Don fronts detained 51,758 men from the beginning of the battle to the 15th of October, with the majority returned to their units. Of those detained, the vast majority of which were from the Don front, 980 were executed and 1,349 sent to penal companies. In the 2-day period between 13 and the 15th of September, the 62nd Army Blocking Detachment detained 1,218 men, returning most to their units while shooting 21 men and arresting 10. Bevor claims that 13,500 Soviet soldiers were executed by Soviet authorities during the battle. However, This claim has been disputed. By the 12th of September, at the time of their retreat into the city, the Soviet 62nd Army had been reduced to 90 tanks, 700 mortars, and just 20,000 personnel. The remaining tanks were used as immobile strongpoints within the city. The initial German attack on the 14th of September attempted to take the city in a rush. The 51st Army Corps 295th Infantry Division went after the Mamayev-Kurgan Hill. The 71st attacked the central rail station and toward the central landing stage on the Volga, while 48th Panzer Corps attacked south of the Saritsa River. Though initially successful, the German attacks stalled in the face of Soviet reinforcements brought in from across the Volga. Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Rifle Division had been hurried up to cross the river and join the defenders inside the city, assigned to counterattack at the Mamayev-Kurgan, and at Railway Station No. 1, it suffered particularly heavy losses. Despite their losses, Rodimtsev's troops were able to inflict similar damage on their opponents. By the 26th of September, the opposing 71st Infantry Division had half of its battalions considered exhausted, reduced from all of them being considered average in combat capability when the attack began 12 days earlier. The brutality of the battle was noted in a journal found on German Lieutenant Wiener of the 24th Panzer Division.
The street is no longer measured by meters, but by corpses. Stalingrad is no longer a town. By day, it is an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke that is a vast furnace, lit by the reflection of the flames, and when night arrives, one of those scorching, howling, bleeding nights, the dogs plunge into the Volga and swim desperately to gain the other bank. The nights of Stalingrad are a terror for them. Animals flee this hell. The hardest stones cannot bear it for long. Only men endure.
A ferocious battle raged for several days at the giant grain elevator in the south of the city. About 50 Red Army defenders, cut off from resupply, held the position for 5 days and fought off 10 different assaults before running out of ammunition and water. Only 40 dead Soviet fighters were found, though the Germans had thought there were many more due to the intensity of resistance. The Soviets burned large amounts of grain during their retreat in order to deny the enemy food. The grain elevator and silos were decided upon by Paulus to be the symbol of Stalingrad for a patch he was having designed to commemorate the battle after victory. Mamayev Kurgan changed hands multiple times over the course of days, with fighting over the hill, rail station and Red Square being so intense that it was difficult to determine who was attacking and who was defending. In another part of the city, a Soviet platoon under the command of Sergeant Yakov Pavlov fortified a 4-story building that oversaw a square 300 meters from the riverbank, which was later called Pavlov's House. The soldiers surrounded it with minefields, set up machine gun positions at the windows, and breached the walls in the basement for better communications. The soldiers found about 10 Soviet civilians hiding in the basement. They were not relieved and not significantly reinforced for 2 months, with the defense lasting around 60 days. The building was labeled Festung Fortress. On German maps, Pavlov was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union title for his actions. General Chuikov took note of the brutal efficiency of the defense of Pavlov's house, stating that Pavlov's small group of men defending one house killed more enemy soldiers than the Germans lost in taking Paris. General Major Hans Dorr stated about the conditions of the battle that
a bitter battle for every house, workshop, water tower, railway embankment, wall, cellar, and every pile of rubble was waged. Without equal even in the First World War, the distance between the enemy's arms and ours was as small as could possibly be. Despite the concentrated air and artillery power, it was impossible to break out of the area of close fighting. The Russians surpassed the Germans in their use of the terrain and in camouflage, and were more experienced in barricade warfare for individual buildings.
Stubborn defenses of semi-fortified buildings in the center of the city cost the Germans countless soldiers. A violent battle occurred for the Univermag department store on Red Square, which served as the headquarters of the 1st Battalion of the 13th Guards Rifle Division's 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment. Another battle occurred for a nearby warehouse dubbed the Nail Factory. In a 3-story building close by, guardsmen fought on for 5 days, their noses and throats filled with brick dust from pulverized walls, with only 6 out of close to half a battalion escaping alive. The Germans made slow but steady progress through the city. Positions were taken individually, but the Germans were never able to capture the key crossing points along the riverbank. By the 27th of September, the Germans occupied the southern portion of the city, but the Soviets held the center and northern part. Most importantly, the Soviets controlled the ferries to their supplies on the east bank of the Volga. After the 27th of September, much of the fighting in the city shifted north to the industrial district. Having slowly advanced over 10 days against strong Soviet resistance, the 51st Army Corps was finally in front of the 3 giant factories of Stalingrad. The Red October Steel Factory, the Barricade Arms Factory, and Stalingrad Tractor Factory. It took a few more days for them to prepare for the most savage offensive of all, which was unleashed on the 14th of October, which Chuikov considered to be the worst day of the battle. exceptionally intense shelling and bombing paved the way for the first German assault groups. The main attack, led by the 14th Panzer and 305th Infantry Divisions, attacked towards the tractor factory, while another assault led by the 24th Panzer Division hit to the south of the giant plant. Worth points out the difficulties the Siberian Division faced, as throughout the course of an entire month, German forces launched 117 assaults at the division's regiments, and on one day they launched 23 attacks. Every trench, pillbox, rifle pit, and ruin in the area was turned into a strong point with its own direction and system of communications. According to Beevor, the Red October complex and Barricade gun factory had been turned into fortresses as lethal as those of Verdun. If anything, they were more dangerous because the Soviet regiments were so well hidden. The danger of the Barricade arms factory was made apparent firsthand by German Sergeant Ernst Wolfart, who witnessed 18 German pioneers get killed by a Russian booby trap. The fighting for the Barricade has been described as some of the most brutal and ferocious fighting ever, with it being stated that the battlefield east of the Barricade blazed with the most violent and profligate clash the world would ever see, and that in regard to hand-to-hand fighting, nowhere was it more brutal, more savage, more relentless than in the Barricade. The German onslaught crushed the 37th Guards Rifle Division of Major General Viktor Joludev, and in the afternoon, the forward assault group reached the tractor factory before arriving at the Volga River, splitting the 62nd Army into two. In response to the German breakthrough to the Volga, the front headquarters committed 3 battalions from the 300th Rifle Division and the 45th Rifle Division of Colonel Vasily Sokolov, a substantial force of over 2,000 men, to the fighting at the Red October factory. According to Worth, here in and around the main building of the October plant, the fighting had gone on for weeks. It had been a hell of shell fire and mortar fire, and tank and air attacks and hand-to-hand fighting. They had fought for a workshop or half a workshop or for the end of a drain pipe. Fighting raged inside the Barricade factory until the end of October. The Soviet-controlled area shrank down to a few strips of land along the western bank of the Volga, and in November, the fighting concentrated around what Soviet newspapers referred to as Lyadnov's Island, a small patch of ground behind the Barricade factory, where the remnants of Colonel Ivan Lyadnov's 138th Rifle Division resisted all ferocious assaults thrown by the Germans and became a symbol of the stout Soviet defense of Stalingrad. In the north of Stalingrad, by early November, the 16th Panzer Division referred to the Rhinock-Spartanovka region as Little Verdun, because there was hardly a square meter that had not been churned up by bombs and shells. 5 to the 12th of September, Luftflotte 4 conducted 7,507 sorties, 938 per day. From 16 to the 25th of September, it carried out 9,746 missions, 975 per day. Determined to crush Soviet resistance, Luftflotte 4's Stukawaffe flew 900 individual sorties against Soviet positions at the Stalingrad tractor factory on the 5th of October. Several Soviet regiments were wiped out. The entire staff of the Soviet 339th Infantry Regiment was killed the following morning during an air raid. The Luftwaffe retained air superiority into November, and Soviet daytime aerial resistance was non-existent. However, the combination of constant air support operations on the German side and the Soviet surrender of the daytime skies began to affect the strategic balance in the air. From the 28th of June to the 20th of September, Luftflotte 4's original strength of 1,600 aircraft, of which 1,155 were operational, fell to 950, of which only 550 were operational. The fleet's total strength decreased by 40%. Daily sorties decreased from 1,343 per day to 975 per day. Soviet offensives in the central and northern portions of the Eastern Front tied down Luftwaffe reserves and newly built aircraft, reducing Luftflotte 4's percentage of Eastern Front aircraft from 60% on the 28th of June to 38% by the 20th of September. The Kampfwaffe bomber force was the hardest hit, having only 232 out of an original force of 480 left. In mid-October, after receiving reinforcements from the Caucasus Theater, the Luftwaffe intensified its efforts against the remaining Red Army positions holding the West Bank. Luftflotte 4 flew 1,250 sorties on the 14th of October, and its Stukas dropped 550 tons of bombs, while German infantry surrounded the three factories. Stukageschwader 1, 2, and 77 had largely silenced Soviet artillery on the eastern bank of the Volga, before turning their attention to the shipping that was once again trying to reinforce the narrowing Soviet pockets of resistance. The 62nd Army had been cut in two, and due to intensive air attack on its supply ferries, was receiving much less material support, with the Soviets forced into a 1-kilometer, 1,000-yard strip of land on the western bank of the Volga. Over 1,208 Stuka missions were flown in an effort to eliminate them. The Soviet bomber force, the Aviatsiya Dalnego Destvia, long-range aviation AD, having taken crippling losses over the past 18 months, was restricted to flying at night. The Soviets flew 11,317 night sorties over Stalingrad and the Don Ben sector between the 17th of July and the 19th of November. These raids caused little damage and were of nuisance value only. As historian Chris Bellamy notes, the Germans paid a high strategic price for the aircraft sent into Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe was forced to divert much of its air strength away from the oil-rich Caucasus, which had been Hitler's original grand strategic objective. The Royal Romanian Air Force was also involved in the Axis air operations at Stalingrad. Starting the 23rd of October 1942, Romanian pilots flew a total of 4,000 sorties, during which they destroyed 61 Soviet aircraft. The Romanian Air Force lost 79 aircraft, most of them captured on the ground along with their airfields. In August 1942, after 3 months of slow advance, the Germans finally reached the riverbanks, capturing 90% of the ruined city and splitting the remaining Soviet forces into 2 narrow pockets. Ice floes on the Volga now prevented boats and tugs from supplying the Soviet defenders. Nevertheless, the fighting continued, especially on the slopes of Mamayev Kurgan and inside the factory area in the northern part of the city. From the 21st of August to the 20th of November, the German 6th Army lost 60,548 men, including 12,782 killed, 45,545 wounded, and 2,221 missing. Fighting for the Volga banks has been noted as the most concentrated and ferocious fighting in perhaps the whole war. recognizing that German troops were ill-prepared for offensive operations during the winter of 1942, and that most of them were deployed elsewhere on the southern sector of the Eastern Front, the Stavka decided to conduct a number of offensive operations between the 19th of November 1942 and the 2nd of February 1943. These operations opened the winter campaign of 1942-1943, the 19th of November 1942 to the 3rd of March 1943, which involved some 15 armies operating on several fronts. As per Zhukov, German operational blunders were aggravated by poor intelligence. They failed to spot preparations for the major counteroffensive near Stalingrad, where there were 10 field, 1 tank, and 4 air armies. During the siege, the German and Allied Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian armies protecting Army Group B's north and south flanks had pressed their headquarters for support. The Hungarian Second Army was given the task of defending a 200 kilometers, 120 miles section of the front north of Stalingrad between the Italian army and Voronezh. This resulted in a very thin line, with some sectors where 1 to 2 kilometers, 0.62 to 1.24 miles, stretches were being defended by a single platoon. Platoons typically have around 20 to 50 men. These forces were also lacking in effective anti-tank weapons. Zhukov states, compared with the Germans, the troops of the satellites were not so well armed, less experienced and less efficient even in defense. Because of the total focus on the city, the Axis forces had neglected for months to consolidate their positions along the natural defensive line of the Don River. The Soviet forces were allowed to retain bridgeheads on the right bank, from which offensive operations could be quickly launched. These bridgeheads, in retrospect, presented a serious threat to Army Group B. Similarly, on the southern flank of the Stalingrad sector, the front southwest of Kotelnikovo was held only by the Romanian 4th Army. Beyond that army, a single German division, the 16th Motorized Infantry, covered 400 kilometers. Paulus had requested permission on the 10th of November to withdraw the 6th Army behind the Don, but was rejected. According to Paulus's comments to his adjutant Wilhelm Adam, there is still the order whereby no commander of an army group or an army has the right to relinquish a village, even a trench, without Hitler's consent. In autumn, Zhukov and Vasilevsky, responsible for strategic planning in the Stalingrad area, concentrated forces in the steppes to the north and south of the city. The northern flank was defended by Romanian units, often in open positions on the steppes. The natural line of defense, the Don River, had never been properly established by the German side. The armies in the area were also poorly equipped in terms of anti-tank weapons. The plan was to punch through the overstretched and weakly defended flanks and surround the German forces in the Stalingrad region. During the preparations for the attack, Marshal Zhukov personally visited the front and, noticing the poor organization, insisted on a one-week delay in the start date of the planned attack. The operation was codenamed Uranus and launched in conjunction with Operation Mars, which was directed at Army Group Center about 1,000 kilometers, 620 miles, to the northwest. The plan was similar to that used by Zhukov to achieve victory at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where he had sprung a double envelopment and destroyed the 23rd Division of the Japanese Army. On the 19th of November 1942, Operation Uranus was launched. The attacking Soviet units under the command of General Nikolai Vatutin consisted of 3 complete armies: the 1st Guards Army, 5th Tank Army, and 21st Army, including a total of 18 infantry divisions, 8 tank brigades, 2 motorized brigades, 6 cavalry divisions, and 1 anti-tank brigade. The preparations for the attack were heard by the Romanians, who pushed for reinforcements, only to be refused. Romania's 3rd Army, which protected the northern flank of the German 6th Army, was overrun due to thin lines and being outnumbered and poorly equipped. On the 20th of November, a second Soviet offensive, 2 armies, was launched to the south of Stalingrad against points held by the Romanian 4th Army Corps. The Romanian forces, made up primarily of infantry, were overrun by large numbers of tanks. The Soviet forces raced west and met on the 23rd of November at the town of Kalach, sealing the ring around Stalingrad. By the time of the encirclement, approximately 330,000 Axis personnel, including Germans, Romanians, Italians, and Croatians, were trapped. Among them were between 40,000 and 65,000 Hilfswillige, Hiwi, or volunteer auxiliaries recruited from Soviet POWs and civilians, These Huey often served in supporting roles but were also deployed in frontline units due to their growing numbers. The conditions within the German 6th Army deteriorated to those reminiscent of World War I trench warfare. Troops were forced to take up positions in the open steppe, lacking basic sanitation, which led to rapid spread of infections and dysentery, further debilitating the soldiers. By the 19th of November 1942, the German forces in the pocket numbered about 210,000, with 50,000 soldiers outside the encirclement. Of those trapped, 10,000 continued to fight, 105,000 eventually surrendered, 35,000 were evacuated by air, and 60,000 died. Despite the 6th Army's dire situation, no reinforcements were pulled from Army Group A in the Caucasus to aid in the relief of Stalingrad. It was only after Soviet forces broke through in Operation Little Saturn, threatening to encircle Army Group A, that a withdrawal was ordered on December 31st to avoid complete entrapment. Army Group Don was established under Field Marshal von Manstein, tasked with leading the 20 German and 2 Romanian divisions encircled at Stalingrad. Despite Manstein's recommendation for a breakout, Hitler insisted on holding the city, relying on an ill-fated airlift to supply the 6th Army, which failed to deliver the necessary supplies. The airlift fell drastically short, delivering only 105 tons per day, far below the required 750 tons. The situation worsened after the Soviets captured Tatsinskaya airfield on the 24th of December, forcing the Germans to relocate their air operations to more distant and less effective bases. As supplies dwindled, starvation and disease ravaged the 6th Army. By the time the airlift was terminated, the Luftwaffe had lost nearly 500 aircraft, including 266 Ju-52s, and failed to maintain adequate supply levels. Ultimately, the failure to relieve Stalingrad sealed the fate of the 6th Army, leading to one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. rescue the Sixth Army, Operation Winter Storm, was developed in full consultation with Führer headquarters. It aimed to break through to the Sixth Army and establish a corridor to keep it supplied and reinforced, so that according to Hitler's order, it could maintain its cornerstone position on the Volga with regard to operations in 1943. Manstein, however, who knew that Sixth Army could not survive the winter there, instructed his headquarters to draw up a further plan in the event of Hitler's seeing sense. This would include the subsequent breakout of Sixth Army in the event of a successful first phase and its physical reincorporation in Army Group Don. This second plan was given the name Operation Thunderclap. Winter Storm, as Zhukov had predicted, was originally planned as a two-pronged attack. One thrust would come from the area of Kotelnikovo, well to the south, and around 160 kilometers, 100 miles from the Sixth Army. The other would start from the sheer front west of the Don, which was little more than 60 kilometers, 40 miles from the edge of the Kessel, but the continuing attacks of Romanenko's 5th Tank Army against the German detachments along the river Sheer ruled out that start line. This left only the 57th Panzer Corps around Kotelnikovo, supported by the rest of Hoth's very mixed 4th Panzer Army, to relieve Paulus's trapped divisions. The 57th Panzer Corps, commanded by General Friedrich Kirchner, had been weak at first. It consisted of 2 Romanian cavalry divisions and the 23rd Panzer Division, which mustered no more than 30 serviceable tanks. The 6th Panzer Division, arriving from France, was a vastly more powerful formation, but its members hardly received an encouraging impression. The Austrian divisional commander, General Erhard Raus, was summoned to Manstein's royal carriage in Kharkov station on the 24th of November, where the field marshal briefed him. He described the situation in very somber terms, recorded Raus. 3 days later, when the first trainload of Raus's division steamed into Kotelnikovo station to unload, his troops were greeted by a hail of shells from Soviet batteries. As quick as lightning, the Panzer Grenadiers jumped from their wagons. But already the enemy was attacking the station with their battle cries of "Hurrah!" By the 18th of December, the German army had pushed to within 48 kilometers, 30 miles, of 6th Army's positions. However, the predictable nature of the relief operation brought significant risk for all German forces in the area. The starving, encircled forces at Stalingrad made no attempt to break out or link up with Manstein's advance. Some German officers requested that Paulus defy Hitler's orders to stand fast and instead attempt to break out of the Stalingrad pocket. Paulus refused, concerned about the Red Army attacks on the flank of Army Group Don and Army Group B in their advance on Rostov-on-Don. An early abandonment of Stalingrad would result in the destruction of Army Group A in the Caucasus, and the fact that his 6th Army tanks only had fuel for a 30 kilometers advance towards Hoth's spearhead, a futile effort if they did not receive assurance of resupply by air. Of his questions to Army Group Don, Paulus was told, "Wait, implement Operation Thunderclap only on explicit orders," Operation Thunderclap being the code word initiating the breakout. On the 16th of December, the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn, which attempted to punch through the Axis army. mainly Italians, on the Don. The Germans set up a mobile defense of small units that were to hold towns until supporting armor arrived. From the Soviet bridgehead at Mamen, 15 divisions, supported by at least 100 tanks, attacked the Italian Caseria and Ravenna divisions. And although outnumbered 9-1, the Italians initially fought well, with the Germans praising the quality of the Italian defenders. But on the 19th of December, with the Italian lines disintegrating, ARMIR headquarters ordered the battered divisions to withdraw to new lines. The fighting forced a total revaluation of the German situation. Sensing that this was the last chance for a breakout, Manstein pleaded with Hitler on the 18th of December, but Hitler refused. Paulus himself also doubted the feasibility of such a breakout. The attempt to break through to Stalingrad was abandoned, and Army Group A was ordered to pull back from the Caucasus. The Sixth Army now was beyond all hope of German relief. While a motorized breakout might have been possible in the first few weeks, the Sixth Army now had insufficient fuel, and the German soldiers would have faced great difficulty breaking through the Soviet lines on foot in harsh winter conditions. But in its defensive position on the Volga, the Sixth Army continued to tie down a significant number of Soviet armies. On the 23rd of December, the attempt to relieve Stalingrad was abandoned and Manstein's forces switched over to the defensive to deal with new Soviet offensives. As Zhukov states, the military and political leadership of Nazi Germany sought not to relieve them, but to get them to fight on for as long possible, so as to tie up the Soviet forces. The aim was to win as much time as possible to withdraw forces from the Caucasus, Army Group A, and to rush troops from other fronts to form a new front that would be able in some measure to check our counteroffensive. The Red Army High Command sent 3 envoys while, simultaneously, aircraft and loudspeakers announced the terms of capitulation on the 7th of January, 1943. The letter was signed by Colonel General of Artillery Voronov and the Commander-in-Chief of the Don Front, Lieutenant General Rokossovsky. A low-level Soviet envoy party, comprising Major Alexander Smyslov, Captain Nikolai Dyatlenko, and a trumpeter, carried generous surrender terms to Paulus. If he surrendered within 24 hours, he would receive a guarantee of safety for all prisoners, medical care for the sick and wounded, prisoners being allowed to keep their personal belongings, normal food rations, and repatriation to any country they wished after the war. Rokossovsky's letter also stressed that Paulus' men were in an untenable situation. Paulus requested permission to surrender, but Hitler rejected Paulus' request out of hand. Accordingly, Paulus did not respond. The German High Command informed Paulus every day that the army holds out longer helps the whole front and draws away the Russian divisions from it. The operation launched on the 10th of January 1943 with what was the single largest bombardment of the war at that point, with nearly 7,000 field guns, launchers and mortars firing against German positions. The operation was likely the largest scale economy of force offensive conducted in military history. The Germans retreated from the suburbs of Stalingrad to the city. The loss of the two airfields, Pitomnik on the 16th of January 1943 and Gumrak on the night of the 21st or the 22nd of January, meant an end to air supplies and the evacuation of the wounded. The third and last serviceable runway was at the Stalingradskaya Flight School, which had its last landings and takeoffs on the 23rd of January. After the 23rd of January, there were no more reported landings, just intermittent airdrops of ammunition and food until the end. Despite the horrendous situation that German forces faced, both starving and running out of ammunition, they continued to resist, with transcripts showing that despite many German soldiers yelling "Hitler kaput" to avoid being shot while surrendering, the level of armed resistance remained extraordinarily high till the end of the battle. In particular, the so-called HIWIS, Soviet citizens fighting for the Germans, had no illusions about their fate if captured. Bloody urban warfare began again in Stalingrad, but this time it was the Germans who were pushed back to the banks of the Volga. The Germans adopted a simple defense of fixing wire nets over all windows to protect themselves from grenades. The Soviets responded by fixing fishhooks to the grenades, so they stuck to the nets when thrown. On the 22nd of January, Rokossovsky once again offered Paulus a chance to surrender. Paulus requested that he be granted permission to accept the terms. He told Hitler that he was no longer able to command his men, who were without ammunition or food. Hitler rejected it on a point of honor. He telegraphed the Sixth Army later that day, claiming that it had made a historic contribution to the greatest struggle in German history, and that it should stand fast to the last soldier and the last bullet. Hitler told Goebbels that the plight of the Sixth Army was a heroic drama of German history. On the 24th of January, in his radio report to Hitler, Paulus reported 18,000 wounded without the slightest aid of bandages and medicines. On the 26th of January 1943, the German forces inside Stalingrad were split into two pockets north and south of Mamayev Kurgan. The northern pocket, consisting of the 8th Corps under General Walter Heitz and the 11th Corps, was now cut off from telephone communication with Paulus in the southern pocket. Now each part of the cauldron came personally under Hitler. On the 28th of January, the cauldron was split into three parts. The northern cauldron consisted of the 11th Corps, the central with the 8th and 51st Corps, and the southern with the 14th Panzer Corps and 4th Corps without units. The sick and wounded reached 40,000 to 50,000. On the 30th of January 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's coming to power, Goebbels read out a proclamation that included the sentence, "The heroic struggle of our soldiers on the Volga should be a warning for everybody to do the utmost for the struggle for Germany's freedom and the future of our people, and thus, in a wider sense, for the maintenance of our entire continent." The same day, Hermann Göring broadcast from the Air Ministry, comparing the situation of the surrounded German Sixth Army to that of the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. The speech was not well received by soldiers, however. Paulus notified Hitler that his men would likely collapse before the day was out. In response, Hitler then issued a tranche of field promotions to the Sixth Army's officers, with Paulus made a Generalfeldmarschall. In deciding to promote Paulus, Hitler noted that there was no record of a German or Prussian field marshal having ever surrendered. The implication was clear. If Paulus surrendered, he would shame himself and would become the highest-ranking German officer ever to be captured. As a result, Hitler believed that Paulus would either fight to the last man or commit suicide. On the next day, the southern pocket in Stalingrad collapsed. Soviet forces reached the entrance to the German headquarters in the ruined gun department store. Major Anatoly Soldatov described the conditions of the department store basement as such. It was unbelievably filthy. You couldn't get through the front or back doors. The filth came up to your chest, along with human waste and who knows what else. The stench was unbelievable. When interrogated by the Soviets, Paulus claimed that he had not surrendered. He said that he had been taken by surprise. He denied that he was the commander of the remaining northern pocket in Stalingrad and refused to issue an order in his name for them to surrender. The central pocket, under the command of Heitz, surrendered the same day, while the northern pocket, under the command of General Karl Strecker, held out for 2 more days. 4 Soviet armies were deployed against the northern pocket. At 4 in the morning on the 2nd of February, Strecker was informed that one of his own officers had gone to the Soviets to negotiate surrender terms. Seeing no point in continuing, he sent a radio message saying that his command had done its duty and fought to the last man. When Strecker finally surrendered, he and his chief of staff, Helmuth Grosskirth, drafted the final signal sent from Stalingrad, purposely omitting the customary exclamation to Hitler, replacing it with "Long live Germany." Around 91,000 exhausted, ill, wounded, and starving prisoners were taken. The prisoners included 22 generals. Hitler was furious and confided that Paulus could have freed himself from all sorrow and ascended into eternity and national immortality, but he prefers to go to Moscow.